Hello and welcome to this program on population dynamics and climate change adaptation policy. Climate change has been described as the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. World population is projected to reach 9.1 billion by the year 2050, with most of this growth in developing countries. While the principal cause of the climate change is high consumption in the developed countries, its impact will be greatest on people in the developing world. Climate change and population can be linked through adaptation, reducing vulnerability to the adverse effects of the climate change, and more controversially through mitigation, that is reducing the greenhouse gases that causes climate change. The contribution of low income high fertility countries to global carbon emission has been negligible to date, but is increasing with the economic development that they need to reduce poverty. Rapid population growth endangers human development, provisions of basic services and poverty eradications, and weakens the capacity of the poor communities to adapt to climate change. Significant mass migration is likely to occur in response to climate change and should be regarded as a legitimate response to the effects of climate change. Linking population dynamics with climate change is a sensitive issue, but family planning programs that respect and protect human rights can bring a remarkable range of benefits. Population dynamics have not been integrated systematically into climate change science. The contribution of population growth, migration, urbanization, aging, and household composition to mitigation and adaptation programs needs urgent investigation. Now let us talk about mitigation and adaptation. It is important to recognize two distinct ways in which population issues can be linked to climate change. Mitigation, that is reducing the greenhouse gases that causes climate change, and adaptation, that is reducing vulnerability to the adverse effect of climate change. Few experts doubt the importance of population in relation to climate change adaptation, but the link between the population and climate change mitigation is more controversial. The statement that people causes climate change is often made to emphasize that climate change as it is currently unfolds is a human induced rather than a natural phenomenon. However, the principal cause of climate change is high consumption by people in developed countries where population growth has been low or negative. It is more accurate to say that consumers rather than people cause climate change. There is an enormous variation in greenhouse gas emissions between individuals with high consumption levels in developed countries with low fertility rates and individuals with low or negligible consumption in poor nations with high fertility rates. In other words, climate change is driven more by consumer behavior than simply by population number. While acknowledging the lack of association between population growth and greenhouse gases in the past, the relation between these two dynamics in the future become more critical. Lower middle income nations such as China with rapidly developing economies are already contributing an increasing proportion of the growth in global greenhouse gas emissions. In simplistic terms, it is the pattern of development and consumer behavior in such countries that will determine the nature and extent of links between population dynamics and the climate change in the future. This does not detract from the view that larger future world population will face greater challenges than smaller ones in achieving climate sustainable emissions, and that the total human impact on the earth system scales with population. In starker terms, China has claimed that its one-child policy, which is estimated to have reduced the population of China by 500 million from a projected 1.8 billion without such a policy to the current level of 1.3 billion, should be seen as contributing to its overall actions on climate change. Rapid population growth has a negative impact on human development, provision of basic services and poverty eradication. These effects are magnified and become more urgent in the context of climate change. Reducing the rate of population growth has long been a developmental goal because of the detrimental effect of rapid population growth on economic development. No country, barring a few oil-rich states, has risen from poverty while still maintaining high average fertility. In developing countries where birth rates have successfully declined, particularly Asia and Latin America, by about 25 to 40%, the resulting economic growth can be directly attributed to fertility decline. The link between slowing population growth and enhanced economic development is well documented, particularly at the micro level. Rapid rates of population growth in the sub-Saharan Africa are impeding its ability to even contain the number of people living in extreme poverty. Although there has been a significant reduction in the percentage from 45% in 1990 to 41% in 2004, the actual number of people living in extreme poverty continues to rise by more than 55 million due to population growth. High population growth fueled by high fertility impedes progress towards achievement of the Millennium Developmental Goals and sustains poverty. The central phenomenon underlying vulnerability to climate change. This situation is illustrated by a series of developing country-led reports, the National Adaptation Programs of Action, that is NAPAS, which document the most pressing vulnerability to climate change impacts and the most urgent adaptation priorities. Nearly all 37 out of 40 NAPA reports refer to population growth as a significant factor that exacerbates the harmful impacts of climate change. They describe the impact of population growth on fresh water availability, on land degradation and soil erosion through overgrazing, deforestation and migration to coastal areas that are vulnerable to rising sea levels, floods and cyclones. In brief, rapid population growth acts in tandem with climate change to deplete key natural resources such as water, fuel and soil fertility. Rapid population growth can cause a significant increase in demand and often mismanagement of natural resources that are compromised and in decline due to environmental variability and climate change. Population growth heightens human vulnerability to climate change in numerous ways and may force people to migrate to areas that are either environmentally marginal or more at risk to negative impacts of climate change. For example, population growth in Ethiopia is resulting in soil degradation, dwindling land holdings and low agricultural productivity, which increases pressure on poor people to move either to environmentally marginal or urban areas. This leaves them more vulnerable and more likely to exploit new resources in an unsustainable way, leading to a vicious cycle of poverty and degradation. Now, migration. Migration is a crucial aspect of the link between population and climate change. Large-scale population movement is likely to intensify as changing climate leads to the abandonment of flooded or arid and inhospitable environments. The resulting mass migration will lead to many serious health problems, both directly from the various stresses of the migration process and indirectly from the possible civil strife that could result from chaotic movement of people. Millions of people now living in low-lying coastal areas may need to leave their homes if sea levels rise as predicted by most climate change experts. Protracted and severe droughts may drive more farmers from rural areas to cities to seek new livelihoods. Residents of urban slums in flood-prone areas may migrate to rural areas to escape danger. and in some instances gradual environmental degradation may erase income earning opportunities, driving some across national boundaries. The reasons for which people migrate or seek refuge are complex, making it hard to forecast how climate change will affect the future of migration. Nonetheless, climate change seems likely to become a major force for the future population movement, probably mostly through internal displacement, but also to some extent through international migration, particularly for small island states. The majority of environmental migrants have so far come from rural areas within the least developed countries, but in the future there may indeed be unprecedented levels of environmentally induced migration out of urban areas as rising seas threaten to inundate densely populated coastal areas where 60% of the world's 39 largest metropolises or metros are located, including 12 cities with population of more than 10 million. One third of the world's population currently lives within 60 miles of a shoreline. There is an urgent need to encourage the growth of cities in climate safe areas. It is not only rapid population growth but rapid urbanization that is causing problems for the poorest countries. While fertility in urban areas is generally much lower than in rural areas, in-migration can be high, and by the year 2050 it is estimated that 80% of the world's population will live in urban areas, putting huge pressures on infrastructure important for health like water, sanitation, health services, etc., as well as employment opportunities. Social support networks in urban areas are often weak as rural family bases are weakened. Informal urban settlements are growing and people living in them are often faced with the severe health problems. Climate change could exacerbate these problems by increasing in-migration to urban areas from rural agricultural land that is threatened by climate change, or by increasing migration from very poor to moderately poor countries, thus increasing pressure on their infrastructures as well as by direct impacts on the populations of coastal megacities. Migration is a coping strategy employed by many rural communities. Migration associated with environmental decline is usually characterized by short distance and long term movement, and while there are dire prediction for huge number of environmental refugees, these very high figures are unlikely to materialize. However, migrant groups are more vulnerable to a range of stressors, including impacts from climate change and poor access to health care. Why is discussion of population and climate change a sensitive issue? Links between population dynamics and climate change are complex and often controversial. It is politically and ethically important that any discussions of the links between the two recognizes that the northern countries with low population growth are overwhelmingly responsible for climate change, and that southern countries with high population growth have so far contributed very little to the climate change. Sensitivities in discussing population at government or international levels have persisted since human rights concerns were raised in the 1960s and 70s over the aggressive population control policies, notably in India and China. In 1994, the landmark International Conference on Population and Development sought to dispel notions of coercive family planning by promoting a broad rights-based approach to sexual and reproductive health. Nevertheless, sensitivities remain, and discussions of family planning and population in the context of development has only re-emerged in the last couple of years. At the community level, the legacy of population control programs cast a long shadow. There is frequently suspicion about the motivation of those who seek to put in place family planning programs, particularly in developing countries where cultural, social, or religious practices oppose artificial or foreign methods of reducing fertility. Barriers to acceptability of family planning take many forms, including religious opposition, particularly from the Catholic Church, adverse political influence, including US administrations of recent presidents Bush and Reagan, and legal and policy prohibitions. Despite convincing evidence that maternal mortality and morbidity can be significantly reduced by increasing access to family planning services. The complexity and sensitivity of the issue makes it imperative that debate is right focused and constructive. If the present scenario continues, in which the industrialized North does not radically reduce its carbon emissions, then advocating reduced population growth in the South risks appearing to blame the victim, that is, blame climate change on the population growth in the South, instead of acknowledging that South will suffer most from the climate change caused by consumption in the North. Recent publicity on links between population growth and climate change has tended to polarize the issue, with advocates for significant reduction in carbon emissions identifying population growth as at best a distraction from the main issue, and at worst an attempt by the population control lobby to attract climate change funding for their work. In fact, very few organizations deny that reductions in both consumption in the North and global population growth, which are important. It is often a question of which they emphasize more. What can be done now to improve the situation? Now, discussion of strategies to reduce carbon emission is beyond the scope of this lecture. However, one strategy, contraction and convergence, must be highlighted because population is a key factor in its chance of success. Contraction and convergence seeks to reduce overall carbon emissions to a sustainable level, according to an equal share of emissions per person globally. Industrialized countries would dramatically reduce their emissions, while developing countries would increase theirs up to an internationally agreed ceiling level to allow for and stimulate development and poverty reduction. Population is the major denominator of this model and a major determinant of whether a global, feasible and equitable per capita emission figure can be achieved. Secondly, increased investment in family planning is urgently needed for achievement of both developmental and climate change goals. Family planning offers a unique solution among medical interventions. It reduces poverty and maternal and child mortality, increases primary schooling and women's education and empowerment. It increases environmental sustainability and mitigates the effects of climate change through stabilization of global populations. Recent evidence indicates continued high level of unmet need for family planning and other reproductive health services. Despite gains in recent years, an estimated 215 million women who want to avoid a pregnancy are not using an effective method of contraception. Some countries have experienced little recent change in the use of modern family planning, and others continue to have a very low level of use. In Bangladesh, Kenya and Pakistan, the use of modern methods appears to have stalled at about 47, 32 and 20% respectively. Among married women of reproductive age, in a number of West African countries such as Niger and Nigeria, fewer than 10% of married women practice modern contraception. The impact of family planning in reducing maternal mortality, unsafe abortion, infant and child mortality makes it an extremely cost-effective investment. As confirmed by the latest figure, if all women needing modern contraceptives were to receive them, the cost of family planning services would increase from the current level of $3.1 billion to $6.7 billion, but substantial saving would accrue. For example, reducing unintended pregnancies by meeting family planning needs would save $5.1 billion US that would otherwise be used to care for pregnant women and newborns. The cost of providing a package of family planning, maternal and newborn services to all women in developing countries who need them is equivalent to an average yearly cost of $4.5 per person and $3.30 for maternal and newborn care and $1.2 for contraceptive services. This cost compares favorably with other cost-effective health interventions such as antiretroviral therapies and childhood immunizations. Despite the evident need for family planning services, their contribution to achievement of the MDGs and their cost effectiveness, there is a lack of global investment in family planning. The decline in funding for family planning over the last 15 years must be reversed. Although there was global agreement following the International Conference on Population and Development about the value of sexual and reproductive health and rights for a wide range of international development priorities, funding for family planning services has declined over the last 15 years. This has in part been due to lack of visibility of sexual and reproductive health and rights in MDG framework, an omission that was partially addressed in 2005 by the addition of Target 5B under the Maternal Health Goal to achieve universal access to sexual and reproductive health by 2015. Substantial evidence exists to demonstrate the contribution that sexual and reproductive health and right can make to the MDGs. Recommendation for action on population and climate change. Increased investment in family planning to address unmet need, promote right-based development and contribute to climate change adaptation. Increased investment in female education to enable control of fertility and develop a skilled labor force to maximize potential demographic dividends. Effective leadership to ensure that population and its importance in relation to climate change is discussed at the most influential level nationally and internationally to bring about joint action. Expansion of successful locally led action on climate change, including the national adaptation programs of action to ensure that climate change adaptation reflects local knowledge, skills and expertise. Forward planning in relation to services, housing, land and property to accommodate expected changes in migration patterns in response to the effects of climate change. Stronger initiatives to encourage development of cities in climate safe areas. What are the major gaps in knowledge about population dynamics and climate change? Population dynamics have not been integrated systematically into climate change science. Research is urgently needed to clarify the contribution of population growth, migration, urbanization, aging and household composition to effective climate change mitigation and adaptation programs. Relatively little research has been conducted to explore the links between population dynamics and climate change. The most comprehensive modeling analysis to date using climate forecasts from the IPCC identifies population growth, economic growth, technological change and changes in the patterns of energy and land use as the major driving forces of CO2 emissions. However, the treatment of population in the models has been questioned. While the modeling generally shows positive association between population size and emissions outcomes, other important variables such as urbanization, aging and household size have not been adequately taken into account. Thus far, the IPCC has not addressed population dynamics or the potential policy implications in relations to climate change in any depth. Now we come to the conclusion. The climate change and population can be linked through adaptation, that is reducing vulnerability to the adverse effect of climate change, and more controversially through mitigation, that is reducing greenhouse gases that causes climate change. The contribution of low income, high fertility countries to global carbon emissions has been negligible to date, but is increasing with the economic development that they need to reduce poverty. Rapid population growth endangers human development, provision of basic services and poverty eradication, and weakens the capacity of poor communities to adapt to climate change. It is important to recognize two distinct ways in which population issues can be linked to climate change: mitigation, that is reducing the greenhouse gases that causes climate change, and adaptation, that is reducing vulnerability to the adverse effect of climate change. Few experts doubt the importance of population in the relation to climate change adaptation, but the link between population and climate change mitigation is more controversial. Contraction and convergence seeks to reduce overall carbon emissions to a sustainable level according to an equal share of emissions per person globally. Industrialized countries would dramatically reduce their emissions, while developing countries would increase theirs to an internationally agreed ceiling level to allow for and to stimulate development and poverty reduction. Increased investment in family planning is urgently needed for achievement of both development and climate change goals. Family planning offers a unique solution among medical interventions. It reduces poverty and maternal and child mortality, increases primary schooling and women's education and empowerment. It increases environmental sustainability and mitigates the effects of climate change through stabilization of global population. I hope this interaction was of some use to you all. Thank you so much for watching.